This is part 27 of Good Omens. Bullets of ice shredded the leaves around them as Adam led them down into the quarry. Dog slunk along with his tail between his legs, whining. This wasn't right, he was thinking. Just when I was getting the hang of rats. Just when I nearly sorted out that bloody German shepherd across the road. Now he's going to end it all, and I'll be back with the old glowing eyes and chasing lost souls. What's the sense in that? They don't fight back, and there's no taste to 'em. Wensleydale, Brian, and Pepper were not thinking quite so coherently. All that they were aware of was that they could no more not follow Adam than fly. To try to resist the force marching them forward would simply result in multiply broken legs, and they'd still have to march. Adam wasn't thinking at all. Something had opened in his mind and was aflame. He sat them down on the crate. "We'll all be all right down here," he said. Said Wensleydale, "don't you think our mothers and fathers—" "Don't you worry about them," said Adam loftily. "I can make some new ones. There won't be any of this being in bed at 9:30 either. You don't ever have to go to bed ever if you don't want to, or tidy your room or anything. You just leave it all to me and it will be great." He gave them a manic smile. "I've got some new friends coming," he confided. "You'll like them." "But," Wensleydale began. "You just think of all the amazing stuff afterwards," said Adam enthusiastically. "You can fill up America with all new cowboys and Indians and policemen and gangsters and cartoons and spacemen and stuff. Won't that be fantastic?" Wensleydale looked miserably at the other two. They were sharing a thought that none of them would be able to articulate very satisfactorily even in normal times. Broadly, it was that there had once been real cowboys and gangsters, and that was great. And there would always be pretend cowboys and gangsters, and that was also great. But real pretend cowboys and gangsters that were alive and not alive and could be put back in their box when you were tired of them, this did not seem great at all. The whole point about gangsters and cowboys and aliens and pirates was that you could stop being them and go home. "But before all that," said Adam darkly, "we're really going to show 'em." There was a tree in the plaza. It wasn't very big, and the leaves were yellow, and the light it got through the excitingly dramatic smoked glass was the wrong sort of light. It was on more drugs than an Olympic athlete, and loudspeakers nested in the branches. But it was a tree, and if you half closed your eyes and looked at it over the artificial waterfall, you could almost believe that you were looking at a sick tree through a fog of tears. Jamie Hernandez liked to have his lunch under it. The maintenance supervisor would shout at him if he found out, but Jamie had grown up on a farm, and it had been quite a good farm, and he had liked trees, and he didn't want to have to come into the city, but what could you do? It wasn't a bad job, and the money was the kind of money his father hadn't dreamed of. His grandfather hadn't dreamed of any money at all. He hadn't even known what money was until he was 15. But there were times when you needed trees, and the shame of it, Jamie thought, was that his children were growing up thinking of trees as firewood, and his grandchildren would think of trees as history. But what could you do? Where there were trees now, there were big farms. Where there were small farms, now there were plazas. And where there were plazas, there were still plazas, and that's how it went. He hid his trolley behind the newspaper stand, sat down furtively, and opened his lunchbox. It was then that he became aware of the rustling, and a movement of shadows across the floor. He looked around. The tree was moving. He watched it with interest. Jamie had never seen a tree growing before. The soil, which was nothing more than a scree of some sort of artificial clippings, was actually crawling as the roots moved around under the surface. Jamie saw a thin white shoot creep up from the side of the raised garden area and prod blindly at the concrete of the floor. Without ever knowing why, he nudged it gently with his foot until it was close to the crack between the slabs. It found it and bored down. The branches were twisting into different shapes. Jamie heard the screech of traffic outside the building, but didn't pay any attention to it. Someone was yelling something, but someone was always yelling in Jamie's vicinity, often at him. The questing root must have found the buried soil. It changed color and thickened like a fire hose when the water is turned on. The artificial waterfall stopped running. Jamie visualized fractured pipes blocked with sucking fibers. Now he could see what was happening outside. The street surface was heaving like a sea. Saplings were pushing up between the cracks. Of course, he reasoned, they had sunlight. His tree didn't. All it had was the muted gray light that came through the dome 4 stories up. Dead light. But what could you do? You could do this. The elevators had stopped running because the power was off, but it was only 4 flights of stairs. Jamie carefully shut his lunchbox and padded back to his cart, where he selected his longest broom. People were pouring out of the building, yelling. Jamie moved amiably against the flow like a salmon going upstream. A white framework of girders, which the architect had presumably thought made a dynamic statement about something or other, held up the smoked glass dome. In fact, it was some sort of plastic, and it took Jamie, perched on a convenient strip of girder, all his strength and the full leverage of the broom's length to crack it. A couple more swings brought it down in lethal shards. The light poured in, lighting up the dust in the plaza so that the air looked as though it was full of fireflies. Far below, the tree burst the walls of its brushed concrete prison and rose like an express train. Jamie had never realized that trees made a sound when they grew, and no one else had realized it either because the sound is made over hundreds of years in waves 24 hours from peak to peak. Speed it up, and the sound of the tree makes it vroom. Jamie watched it come toward him like a green mushroom cloud. Steam was billowing out from around its roots. The girders never stood a chance. The remnant of the dome went up like a ping-pong ball in a water spray. It was the same over all the city, except that you couldn't see the city anymore. All you could see was the canopy of green. It stretched from horizon to horizon. Jamie sat on his bench, clung to a Lena, and laughed and laughed and laughed. Presently, it began to rain. The Kapamaki, a whale researching ship, was currently researching the question, how many whales can you catch in 1 week? Except that today there weren't any whales. The crew stared at the screens, which by the application of ingenious technology could spot anything larger than a sardine and calculate its net value on the international oil market, and found them blank. The occasional fish that did show up was barreling through the water as if in a great hurry to get elsewhere. The captain drummed his fingers on the console. He was afraid that he might soon be conducting his own research project to find out what happened to a statistically small sample of whaler captains who came back without a factory ship full of research material. He wondered what they did to you. Maybe they locked you in a room with a harpoon gun and expected you to do the honorable thing. This was unreal. There ought to be something. The navigator punched up a chart and stared at it. "Honorable, sir?" he asked. "What is it?" said the captain testily. "We seem to have a miserable instrument failure. Seabed in this area should be 200 meters. What of it?" "I'm reading 15,000 meters, honorable sir, and still falling." "That is foolish. There is no such depth." The captain glared at several million yen worth of cutting-edge technology and thumped it. The navigator gave a nervous smile. "Ah, sir," he said, "it is shallower already." Sorry. Beneath the thunders of the upper deep, as Zarafel and Tinson both knew, far, far beneath in the abyssal sea, the Kraken slept. And now it was waking up. Millions of tons of deep ozone cascade off its flanks as it rises. "See," said the navigator, 3,000 meters already. The Kraken doesn't have eyes. There has never been anything for it to look at. But as it billows up through the icy waters, it picks up the microwave noise of the sea, the sorrowing beeps and whistles of the whale song. Said the navigator. 1,000 meters? The Kraken is not amused. 500 meters? The factory ship rocks on the sudden swell. 100 meters? There is a tiny metal thing above it. The Kraken stirs, and 10 billion sushi dinners cry out for vengeance. The cottage windows burst inward. This wasn't a storm. It was war. Fragments of jasmine whirled across the room, mingled with the rain of file cards. Newt and Anathema clung to one another in the space between the overturned table and the wall. "Go on," muttered Newt. "Tell me Agnes predicted this." "She did say he bringeth the storm," said Anathema. "This is a bloody hurricane. Did she say what's supposed to happen next?" 2315 is cross-reference to 3477, said Anathema. "You can remember details like that at a time like this?" "Since you mention it, yes," she said. She held out a card. 3477. Let the wheel of fate turn, its hearts enjoin. There are other fires than mine. When the wind bloweth the blossoms, reach out to one another, for the calm cometh when red and white and black and pale approach to peas in our profession. Question mark. Some mythicism here, one fears. A.F. Device, October 17th, 1889. Peas, blossoms, OFD, 1929, September 4th. Revelations chapter 4 again, I presume. Dr. Throst Device, 1835. Newt read it again. There was a sound outside like a sheet of corrugated iron pinwheeling across the garden, which was exactly what it was. Is this supposed to mean, he said slowly, that we're supposed to become an item, that Agnes was a joker? Courting is always difficult when the one being courted has an elderly female relative in the house. They tend to mutter or cackle or bum cigarettes or, in the worst case, get out the family photograph album, an act of aggression in the sex war which ought to be banned by a Geneva Convention. It's much worse when the relative has been dead for 300 years. Newt had indeed been harboring certain thoughts about anathema, not just harboring them, in fact, but dry docking them, refitting them, giving them a good coat of paint, and scraping the barnacles off their bottom. But the idea of Agnes's second sight pouring into the back of his neck sloshed over his libido like a bucket full of cold water. He had even been entertaining the idea of inviting her out for a meal, but he hated the idea of some Cromwellian witch sitting at her cottage 3 centuries earlier and watching them eat. He was in the mood in which people burned witches. His life was quite complicated enough without it being manipulated across the centuries by some crazed old woman. A thump in the grate sounded like part of the chimney stack coming down. And then he thought, my life isn't complicated at all. I can see it as clearly as Agnes might. It stretches all the way to early retirement, a whip round from the people in the office, a bright little neat flat somewhere, a neat little empty death. Except now I'm going to die under the ruins of a cottage during what might just possibly be the end of the world. The recording angel won't have any trouble with me. My life must have been dittos on every page for years. I mean, what have I ever really done? I've never robbed a bank. I've never had a parking ticket. I've never eaten Thai food. Somewhere, another window caved in, with a merry tinkle of breaking glass. Anathema put her arms around him with a sigh which really didn't sound disappointed at all. I've never been to America or France because callous doesn't really count. I've never learned to play a musical instrument. The radio died as the power lines finally gave up. He buried his face in her hair. There was a pinging sound. Shadwell, who had been bringing the army pay books up to date, looked up in the middle of signing for Witchfinder Lance Corporal Smith. It took him a while to notice that the gleam of Newt's pin was no longer on the map. He got down from his stool, muttering under his breath, and searched around on the floor until he found it. He gave it another polish and put it back in Tadfield. He was just signing for Witchfinder Private Table, who got an early tuppence a year, hay allowance, when there was another ping. He retrieved the pin, glared at it suspiciously, and pushed it so hard into the map that the plaster behind it gave way. Then he went back to the ledgers. There was a ping. This time the pin was several feet from the wall. Shadwell picked it up, examined its point, pushed it into the map, and watched it. After about 5 seconds, it shot past his ear. He scrambled for it on the floor, replaced it on the map, and held it there. It moved under his hand. He leaned his weight on it. A tiny thread of smoke curled out of the map. Shadwell gave a whimper and sucked his fingers as the red-hot pin ricocheted off the opposite wall and smashed a window. It didn't want to be in Tadfield. 10 seconds later, Shadwell was rummaging through the W.A.'s cash box, which yielded a handful of copper, a 10-shilling note, and a small counterfeit coin from the reign of James I. Regardless of personal safety, he rummaged in his own pockets. The result was a trawl, even with his concessionary travel pass taken into consideration, more barely enough to get him out of the house, let alone to Tadfield. The only other people he knew who had money were Mr. Roget and Madame Tracy, As far as the Rajits were concerned, the question of several weeks' rent would probably crop up in any financial discussion he intrigued at this point. And as for Madame Tracy, who'd only been too willing to lend him a handful of used tenors, "I'll be swagget if I'll take the wages o' sin for the painted Jezebel," he said, which left no one else, save one, the Southern Pansy. They'd each been here just once, spending as little time as possible in the room, and in Aziraphale's case, trying not to touch any flat surface. The other one, the flash Southern bastard in the sunglasses, I did not know that was a thing, was, Shadwell suspected, not someone he ought to offend. In Shadwell's simple world, anyone in sunglasses who wasn't actually on a beach was probably a criminal. He suspected that Crowley was from the Mafia or the underworld, although he would have been surprised how right he merely was. But the soft one in the camel hair coat was a different matter, and he'd risked trailing him back to his base once, and he could remember the way. He thought Aziraphale was a Russian spy. He could ask him for money, threaten him a bit. It was terribly risky. Shadwell pulled himself together. Even now, young Newt might be suffering unimaginable tortures at the hands of the daughters of night, and he, Shadwell, had sent him. "We canna leave our people in there," he said, and put his thin coat and shapeless hat and went out onto the street. The weather seemed to be blowing up a bit.